Hi everyone, my name is Kylie Hurst, and I'm going to be doing my project on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as ALS. Slide. So the contents of this presentation, just briefly, I'm going to go over the definition, going to do some famous faces for you to recognize, just to jog your memory, or to teach you guys about some relevant people who have had or have ALS. We're going to go over the classifications, signs and symptoms, causes, types of ALS, pathophysiology of ALS, diagnosis, management, and then finally some research. So the definition of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or just ALS, what we'll call it from now on, just for short. It's a neuromuscular disease characterized for its progressive degeneration of motor neuron cells in the brain and spinal cord. So in the brain, otherwise known as the cortical spinal motor neurons, and in the spinal cord, or also known as the bulbospinal motor neurons. Basically, when motor neurons can no longer send impulses from the brain to the spinal cord and then to our legs and arms, etc., the muscles of the individual can begin to atrophy until we lose some respiratory muscle tone, and then eventually the individual can no longer breathe on their own, unfortunately. With individuals with ALS, they have no cognitive inhibition. Everything's running just fine up in their noggins. It's just their bodies can no longer be controlled by them. And the respiratory distress can be offset with a tracheostomy, but we'll go over that later. Here's a famous face who had ALS. This is Lou Gehrig. He was born in 1903 and he died in 1941. His full name is Henry Lou Gehrig. He was the first baseman for the New York Yankees, had a lot of notable achievements during his career, went on to being part of the Hall of Fame for baseball, I believe. And so ALS is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease because he was one of the first really big faces in society to be public with his ALS. Next, we have a very recognizable face, Mr. Stephen William Hawking. Unfortunately, he died in 2018, but he was diagnosed at the age of 21, and which is very young for a neuromuscular disease as such. But he lived for 55 years with ALS, and he is considered to be one of the longest living individuals known to have lived with ALS for so long. There are many people who hypothesize that since he was diagnosed at such a young age, that ALS in his case was less sporadic, had a slower progression, just like other juvenile illnesses could be diagnosed at a younger age, like for instance rheumatoid juvenile arthritis is an example to compare that to. And the last one of my famous faces that I wanted to contribute to this presentation is Mr. Steve Gleason. He was a football player for the New Orleans Saints from 2000 to 2008. Was diagnosed in 2011. He's still alive and kicking today, but he is most notable for his forming of the ALS awareness and advocacy group, Team Gleason, with no white flags slogan, never give up kind of ordeal. He wants to focus on life-sustaining, enhancing technology for ALS patients. He partnered with Microsoft to create eye tracking technology and made it readily available for all Windows 10 products around the world. And just recently, he received the Congressional Gold Medal in January, and this is the highest civilian honor bestowed by Congress. And they gave it to him for his work as an advocate for ALS patients. The signs and symptoms of ALS typically present in fasciculations, muscle cramping, spasticity, muscle weakness, dysarthria, dysphagia, multiple falls, and then worsening of motor impairment. The demographics with ALS is typically that Caucasians and non-Hispanics will develop ALS more than other demographic groups, and that individuals will develop ALS around the ages of 55 to 75. More men than women typically have ALS, and military veterans, unfortunately, are 2 times as likely than the general population to develop ALS. So, although there is no definitive cause for ALS at the moment, it has been found that it can be inherited through the SOD1 gene through familial ALS, and they also think that it can happen through physical trauma or concussions, like possibly with Steve Gleason, toxins during warfare, like with military veterans. But unfortunately, there's just no consistent association with developing ALS at the moment. We can only speculate. So for the types of ALS, there's sporadic ALS, like I just talked about, which accounts for 90% of the cases, and familial ALS, which is not as common, but is influenced by genes like the C9orf72. The long version of that is chromosome 9 open reading frame 72, and the SOD1 gene. These are not as common as sporadic ALS cases, but they happen still nonetheless. So with pathophysiology of ALS, they've found that ALS affects the spinal motor neurons of the ventral horn and brainstem motor neurons. They've also seen through autopsies of ALS patients how the loss of motor neurons and atrophic motor neurons they will typically present with a basophilic appearance, and this suggests that it is a programmed, or it's a programmed cell mechanism, and this was according to a study by L.J. Martin in 1999. FTD ALS, or frontal temporal dementia ALS, is a different form of ALS that is typically with familial ALS. This will affect the frontal and temporal complex, the hippocampus and amygdala. Especially with the amygdala, it accounts for the change in behavior. The amygdala is with a lot of emotions. This form of dementia is it's not with memory per se, but it's more behavioral changes. They are very aggressive. People just don't usually act themselves, and I could imagine could be especially as devastating when you can't move your own body and don't feel as yourself either. Cortical spinal and motor neurons, they found that there was retrograde axonal loss and gliosis. Gliosis is a mechanism by your body to help, or it goes to these affected injured sites of your CNS. And these are just trends, not necessarily causes or definitive answers, but just trends nonetheless that I can share. We can diagnose ALS through many techniques. Usually they start with lab tests to do a differential diagnosis to make sure that there's something else that's causing this to happen to you. Then they will usually go through the electromyography, which is EMG, and that measures electrical activity of muscle fibers and it records the response. Also, they would have nerve conduction studies done, which measures electrical activity of the nerves and your nerve's ability to fire an action potential to the muscles. And according to the patients, these can be kind of uncomfortable and painful. For managing ALS, since it is a fatal illness, there can only be management of this illness to make the patient feel more comfortable. So usually they will go through physical therapy, which will be like light aerobic activity, or they'll have some range of motion stretches, speech therapy to keep those tongue muscles activated and just to evaluate how their speech is declining over the long run. There's a medication called Riluzole that is generally a new medication that is being used for ALS patients. It acts by reducing damage to motor neurons by decreasing levels of glutamate. And glutamate transports messages from motor neurons and nerve cells. There's no reversal of damage, unfortunately, with Riluzole, and it only prolongs the life expectancy by about 2 to 3 months. So it is something, but unfortunately not enough for some people. Nutritional assistance, so when they can no longer swallow, they will usually have a G-tube placed. And then respiratory assistance eventually when they can no longer breathe on their own. If they still wish to go on fighting this disease, they will have a tracheostomy done and have a breathing tube placed there for them. I do apologize, it is a little bit over our time limit here at 11 minutes, but hang in with me. This is the last slide. So with research for ALS, there has been this protein called modulating membrelin that was discovered in 2002, and that protein is linked to endoplasmic reticulum associated with degradation systems in our CNS. So in a experiment, they created mice with certain motor neuron astrocytes, microglia, and oligodendrocytes that are mimicked with patients with ALS. They emitted these from these mice. These mice acted the same as ALS patients. And they found that membrelin was deficient around some certain astrocytes that contributed to accumulated glutamate, which is known to kill neurons. The RPS25 gene, that one is a gene that has been shown through studies that could contribute to the formulation of a type of neuron damaging aggregate, kind of like glutamate. So inhibiting this gene has shown to prevent production of this harmful protein to our neurons. So this is another step forward. I skipped over that last part. I do apologize. The adeno-associated virus is part of that research study where they created that virus that it can eliminate the membrelin levels. And this is also a promising potential for therapy. And yeah. And that was my project. This is my work cited. I appreciate you guys listening in. I know it's a little bit over my time allotted, but thank you very much.